Well, I guess we should probably talk some Chiefs, guys. Welcome to the Chief of the North on RGR Football. I am Seth Kaiser, a Minnesota Chiefs fan, or the Chief of the North, or a really disappointed human. Whatever you want to call me is perfectly fine by me. I've decided to show up this week, even if the Chiefs didn't. That's right. We're spicy today. No, it's just such an easy joke to make. Almost as easy as sitting on all horizontal and otherwise short routes and knowing a team's not going to press you down the field. For example, okay, that's the last thing I'm going to say. Well, just similar how it's the last time we saw the Chiefs look good. Okay, no, I'm going to stop doing that. As we do every week, I'm here to talk about the things that stick out to me the most in the Chiefs' most recent game, which was, of course, a Christmas Day horror fest against the Raiders, in which had the offense literally just thrown the football at the ground every single possession, they would have done less damage to their chances to win, or at least evened it out, I guess. Ugh, either way, it's gross. So I want to talk a little bit about just where the Chiefs are at overall. I'm going to answer some mailbag questions. I hope every one of you had a very Merry Christmas, regardless of what the Chiefs tried to do to ruin it. It's just a game, an ugly game, a gross game, a game that really made us all probably question why exactly we care so much, but just a game nonetheless. Um, I want to talk generally, and I wrote about this in the Chief of the North newsletter, how we got here. What I'm going to be looking at later this week, once the All 22 comes out, I'm really interested. I'm probably going to bump up the Patrick Mahomes film review this week because I'm genuinely curious about what he was seeing down the field, what things looked like for him. Because on one hand, I've got a bunch of people telling me, and I don't know how many people know these things. Um, Based on the broadcast view, but if I go to social media, I have hundreds of people telling me that Patrick Mahomes had no one open all day, and I have dozens, maybe getting to the hundreds of people telling me that Patrick Mahomes is just missing a bunch of open receivers, and I have no idea which is true. So that's fun. But I do want to talk a little bit about the Chiefs offense. I'd love to talk about the defense because that would be a lot more fun. They had a relatively dominant outing overall. They couldn't get the stop at the end, but they had gotten like 7 stops previously. They had done more than enough for the Chiefs to win that game by 30. And so, yes, it was unfortunate they couldn't get a stop at the end when the Chiefs finally scored a touchdown, but that just is what it is. These things happen. They were playing an aggressive brand of ball. The Raiders found the right gap. You did have a really unfortunate missed gap of Mike Edwards where he got there late. Just is what it is. Would that have happened with Brian Cook? Probably not. But the defense overall played quite well, more than well enough for the Chiefs to win that game again by like 30 points. The offense, on the other hand, was a complete tire fire. And this time we can blame, two disastrous mistakes. Obviously, Mahomes' awful pick six. People can talk about, Watson not coming back on a comeback route, but given the timing of that route and the placement of the ball, everything, he really didn't have time to come back for the ball. He turned, the ball was there. The defender was sitting on it. It wasn't a throw that should have been made, and it didn't have enough gas on it to really challenge it, even if there had been a little more space. Then, of course, the fumble, trick play, handoff, extravaganza. Oh, that was awful. And yes, the Chiefs did have some drops. They got in their own way a couple times. But overall, it was just a putrid showing by the offense. It wasn't, normally in other games, we've been able to say, well, they moved the ball really well right before they blew their toe off. This time, it really was the offense overall just looked bad outside of, I think, 2 drives the entire game. Maybe 3 drives where they had to settle for a field goal, except they didn't settle for a field goal because Harrison Butker missed a chip shot. That's the kind of day that it was. I want to talk about that offense a little bit because I think when you see the direction things are going, we can sit back and take stock of kind of a bigger picture thing. I know a lot of people want me to talk about coaching. I might a little bit, but I really want to see what things look like the final 2 games and assumingly the playoffs. We'll see whether the playoffs just consist of one game. The Chiefs certainly look like a one and done team right now, but we don't know exactly how that's going to turn out. But it is, I always want to wait till the end of the year before I make a finalized judgment on how the team is adjusting to things, how they're being coached, et cetera, because you can struggle with something all year and then come up with answers for it at the very end. And it's really easy to forget that in the middle part. The Chiefs did a lot of that in 2021. They did a lot of that in 2022. So we'll see how it goes. but there are some things I want to talk about. So basically what I want to do here, we get to our mailbag questions like we do every week. And then I just want to kind of go through the line of how the Chiefs really got to where they're at right now. Because everyone wants to point to one thing generally, but it's not just one thing. There's a bunch of things that have gone wrong here, some of which people talk about all the time, some of which don't get talked about that much. So we're going to try to whip through them right after we whip through some mailbag questions here. These were happier mailbag questions because it was after I was talking about Rashee Rice playing so well, particularly on third down. Like I try to remember to tell you every week, if you have a mailbag question, pop it down there in the comment section, put a question mark or 5 before it so I can see it really easily, and always try to prioritize those. Tika1 asks, what position do you see the Chiefs take round 1 next draft? And which wide receivers do you see returning next year? I think for all everyone's saying, I think Tony and Moore will still be in town. They're on really cheap rookie deals. I just think they're going to get pushed much farther down the chart. I think Watson will be back next year too. But in a perfect world, those are your bottom 3 receivers. And they've gotten 2 new guys at least to be your primary rotation. In terms of round 1, I think it depends on what they think of Wanya Morris. I kind of like him. He does have some issues getting beaten inside. He's not really laterally agile, but I think he's shown enough to where there's a possibility here that he can be your guy at left tackle. Even if he's never going to be an elite one, I think he's going to be a good enough one, and that matters a great deal. And so I would like to see them go with wide receiver. I'd like to see them sign a veteran wide receiver. I'd like to see them draft a wide receiver in the 3rd or 4th round too. I would like wherever they have picks. I can't remember. They don't have a ton of draft picks this year, but I would like to see them double and triple down on wide receiver, knowing that everything ebbs and flows in the NFL. You don't really have any team that is going to be dominant at every single position group on both sides of the ball. The NFL is just not built that way. But I would like to see them rebuild the wide receiver group. They don't need a star. They don't need a true number 1. They didn't have one last year, but that's not necessarily proof of concept because of what they have with Kelsey and all that sort of thing. But you do need multiple good players, or at least average to above average players. And this year they haven't had that, unfortunately. You need more consistency, and so they need bodies in that wide receiver room, certainly. IDWBN says, Seth, love your perspective on things. Thank you. Do you think they should switch roles with Tony and James? Let Tony be the full-time returner and give James more work on offense. We saw James a little bit more on Monday or yesterday, I suppose. And he did pretty well with the job he was doing, executed. I looked like a Mills concept pretty well, running the dig. Got open a few times. He is a average wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4 type, which on this Chiefs team, he might be the 2nd best wide receiver on the team. That's actually true. So I would love to see them doing more with him and have Tony be more of a niche returner, gadget play type guy. He just has shown he can't be trusted going over the middle of the field, and that's problematic. Personally, I think if Tony gets healthy, you put him on the boundary and let him run go routes and maybe see if he can win a couple down the field. Might as well. You've tried everything else with him. Let's see. The Count Chocula question got some fun comments here. Liam's son asks if someone like Marvin Harrison can decide he wants to play for, not participate in the draft, but come in as a walk-on. No, you can't. You got to participate in the NFL as part of the collective bargaining agreement, which means entering through the draft. You can't just skip it and become there's the model is being selected and assigned to a team. So you've got to come in through the draft. You can't come in like as a free agent, quote unquote. Otherwise, everyone would do that. I think Sherry Street asks, out of this team free agents, who do you think Veach keeps and who do they release? And when they release MVS, which is obviously probably a given, do you think they will trade Sky Moore and start over with them too? Maybe with Moore, they might find a taker. There might be a team that says, hey, we can do what you guys haven't. We can develop him. You often see that. I mean, reclamation projects happen all the time. You probably wouldn't get anything more than a 6th or a 7th conditional out of them. And honestly, this offseason, if a team offered a 6th for Moore, I think you jump at the opportunity simply because they need draft capital and they've shown the ability to find guys late in the draft. I think that in terms of the free agents, I think they've got a really tough choice to make between Snead and Jones. Jones is a much more important player to the Chiefs defense, as great as Snead is. But Snead is probably going to cost 2/3 as much, if that. The problem is the entire pass rush, and I wrote about this last week, the entire pass rush is built around Chris Jones. And that is borderline impossible to replace. And so that's part of why I think he probably wanted the money he wanted. And I'm all for players trying to get the bag, do whatever you got to do, and I'm all for teams trying to be financially prudent. I am curious what they do if they decide. I don't think they would tag Chris Jones and then try to keep him around like that. I don't think he'd play on the tag. Um, he's shown he's willing to sit out at least one game. I'm guessing he'd do something similar again next year, and it would mess with, the 1 year financial issues, just like it did with them this year. I'm guessing you could see like a tag and trade. Whereas with Snead, I'm guessing the process will be a lot less contentious. Though I will say, if you were going to sign anything that resembles a quote unquote team friendly deal, which are pretty rare, especially with players of his caliber, I think it would have happened by now. I think today's price is not yesterday's price with L'Jarius Snead. So they really have I'm going to save some of that with, once the offseason begins, because really there's at least, at the very, very, very least, 2 games left of the season, probably more likely 3 games or 4 games, maybe more, depending on how they do. And at that point, you can get a little more of an idea of what you can do in terms of the free agency aspect of things. All right, let's talk the Chiefs offense. Normally, this would be the part where I would show you some game clips and that kind of thing. I'm not going to do that here, other than let's just be put in a better mood for like just a second at least, and just say that was an incredible play. And I really thought that the Chiefs might come back in that moment. Just unbelievable. Created a touchdown out of absolutely nothing. Overall, though, Mahomes, I'll say this I haven't reviewed the film. The All-22 is not out yet. Mahomes, as far as I can tell, did not play well yesterday. I know, it's shocking, except it's kind of not if you were watching the game. But I don't see yet what he was looking at when he was looking down the field. And people telling me based on broadcast views and stuff, oh, this guy, that guy looked like they were open this. We have no idea. Not without the All-22. You have no idea whether or not you could have an NFL defender who's 10 yards away and not even in the screen in terms of a broadcast view. But if his momentum, if he's breaking on the route already, you can't throw it because he will break on that route and pick it off. So NFL Open is kind of a different gig. Quarterbacks are expected to fit it into tighter windows, but the defenders are so fast that not everything that's open is actually open. So I'm going to figure that out. Like I said, I'm going to bump that up first. I want to talk about the offense overall and how we got here. I'll start with the obvious, but I'll try to say it in a non-obvious way. The wide receiver room, basically Brett Veach and Andy Reid, I think they tried to sign some guys this offseason. We've heard a lot about it. We've heard that they tried to trade up in the draft. They knew the wide receiver room was a potential issue. That's all anyone talked about all offseason. But I do think they thought between Moore and Tony, they thought one of them would take a step up in the offense to be able to be maybe 85, 90% of what Juju was last year. That bet obviously failed spectacularly. The other thing that people don't talk about as much as maybe they should is MVS being significantly worse than he was last year in terms of timing, in terms of spacing, in terms of tracking the ball, in terms of reading safeties, where he's going to be going, being on the same page as Mahomes. He's significantly worse. And the way I phrased it in the article I just put on the Chief of the North newsletter, where I kind of break all of this down in a lot more detail, it's as though they lost last year's MVS as well. They didn't just lose one veteran receiver. They lost 2 because, there's this assumption we make as fans, and this is going to come into play in just a second here. There's an assumption we make as fans that if the same guy is in the building, he's the same guy that he was the year before, but that's not true, right? One of the things about average NFL players is they're not like this, right? Constantly. That's not how this works. You see ups and downs generally to reach that average point. It's especially true with corners and offensive linemen. And with MVS this year, we've seen him take a marked step down, which is really, really unfortunate because, man, talk about a year they needed him. If you just take MVS and how he played last year and transpose it into this year, the Chiefs have probably won at least one extra game, and their offense overall would look a lot more coherent because one of the problems they're having is they don't trust anything down the field. And other than really specific circumstances, and that's affected how Mahomes is playing. It's affected how defenses are playing them. And if MVS was at least a competent deep threat like he was last year, that changes the analysis a great deal. What I would always say last year is what he did wasn't necessarily just on the box sheet, but this year it's not there. But losing him and Juju has been borderline catastrophic. And what someone might say is, well, isn't Rashee Rice better than Juju Smith-Schuster, or at least as good? Sort of, but they're different players. Rice is still working on his ability to consistently separate against man, in that he's not very good at it. Juju wasn't a great man coverage separator, but underneath he could create some separation on some of these little quick curls, whip routes, slants, that sort of thing. Rice has shown the ability to do some of it, but not as consistently. And when you throw in the ability to make sight adjustments with consistency and all of those things that Juju Smith-Schuster did well, while they might be equivalent as players, I think they might be, roles are a little bit different. And what Juju did could cover up a little bit more on some of the things the Chiefs are struggling with. So you lose Juju, you basically lose MVS, you don't get the step forward from Moore and Tony, and you just end up with a completely barren cupboard at the wide receiver position. It is just gross. Sorry, one of my colleagues was standing outside my office, thought he might need something. So yes, that's a problem. However, some other things aren't getting talked about enough, and I went in depth on this. And again, you can check it out, Chief of the North newsletter, mnchiefsfan.substack.com, bit.ly/Seth really hates money. If you're looking for a late Christmas gift, you can gift it to someone. Let them read about the horror that is the Kansas City Chiefs, maybe even an enemy, or like a Bengals fan or something. The offensive line has regressed too, though, and everyone wants to talk about Jawan Taylor, and I understand why. However, the tackles have not been particularly good, but the interior line hasn't been as good as it was last year either, and that's not being talked about enough. And that's the thing. Players are not the same guy every single year. Creed Humphrey has been good this year, very good even, but not quite as good as he was last year. Trey Smith, especially in pass protection, has not been as good as he was last year. I'm assuming he's been playing a little bit banged up. And so I think with that, it's not just the tackles. Last year, the tackles were problematic at times, but the interior O-line was so great consistently, especially Creed and Tooney in pass protection, and Trey Smith was quite good as well, not quite as consistent. This year, so let's say the tackles stay roughly the same or maybe get a little worse. It just kind of depends on your point of view on that. I could see it argued both ways. Because Jawan Taylor, just on a side note, hasn't been as good in pass protection as he was last year. And then, of course, there's the penalties, penalty after penalty. Anyway, but if let's say you maintain equivalent where you still have some problems here on the outside, if your interior is not elite, now suddenly you've got a couple extra pressures a game, couple extra stuffs a game, just a couple extra problems a game. And that's been a problem for this year. And that's one of those things where you just never know what you're going to get year to year in the NFL. If a position, this team was built with the idea that the offensive line would be one of the bases of a dominant offense. It was going to be Mahomes, Kelsey, and a dominant offensive line with Pacheco, because he's a running back, sprinkled in. The offensive line hasn't been dominant, and that's as big a part of problem with how their plan has not come to fruition as anything else, and that should get talked about more. When you take those two things, the wide receivers and the line, what you have is Travis Kelsey and Patrick Mahomes pressing, and you see it. Both of them, people talk about Travis Kelsey's washed. I don't know if he's washed. He still creates separation really consistently. I don't think he creates separation against man coverage quite as well as he used to. And refs are really getting after him about pass interference this year, which is funny because guys play him very physically. And because he's stronger than them, he's always been able to punish them for that by pushing off them. But this year, for some reason, they're calling it a little more. Kelsey's still consistently getting open, but the problem is teams don't have to worry about anything else. And so everything gets tougher. Everything gets more condensed, and he starts pressing. And Kelsey, when he's pressing, isn't as good a player as when he's not. He's one of those guys that doesn't play as well angry as he does when he's kind of fired up. And you've seen that with him, that frustration. And that's as good as he's been. He's still been excellent. That's problematic. With Mahomes, same thing. You see him making more bad decisions. I've charted him bailing out of a few more clean pockets, missing shots at a much higher rate than he did last year because he doesn't trust what he's seen. Now, you can call that a chicken or egg thing and say, well, you're making excuses for Mahomes. I'm not. He still needs to see it correctly, but he's not. And looking at the why isn't the same thing as making an excuse. But so then what you have now is Mahomes starts pressing and therefore plays at a lower level than he played at last year. And so now you've got the wide receiver room, the bottom fell out. The offensive line isn't playing quite as well. Kelsey's not playing quite as well. Now Mahomes isn't playing quite as well. And it all just starts getting into this giant snowball of crap, basically, where everything just is now feeding off of itself. And that's what you saw against the Raiders. Raiders came to play. They did a great job. They played like they were in the Chiefs huddle. But a lot of that was the problems that we've talked about. And And that's where you can get to coaching. The Chiefs have tried to compensate by simplifying some concepts and by basically shifting to like an early Andy Reid 20 years ago, or like the 13, 14, 15, 16 type seasons in Kansas City with a ton of horizontal stuff. And they've been able to get by with it in some games to move the ball. The Raiders were just sitting on them. That's one reason why that pick six happened. They don't have any fear of getting beaten deep. It's one reason Rashee Rice still had an okay game, but they were waiting on those screens. They were waiting on that horizontal stuff. They were waiting on your traditional running back screens. And right now, the Chiefs don't have a way to make teams pay for doing that because they're not threatening down the field, and the pass protection hasn't held up as much as you'd want. Or when those two things do happen, Mahomes is jittery because of the times they didn't happen. And then he makes a mistake. He sees his first read cover, and rather than staying in the pocket and looking, he bails, trying to create. How it's very rare that you see him in rhythm making throws at this point. And again, I think that started with the offense, but that doesn't excuse him for him parting it right now, because in an attempt to fix the problem by creating, right, the 2018 version of himself, he has become part of the problem because you can't get away with it too often. And you also are in a situation where the snaps where the offensive line and the wide receivers do get it right, he's missing that sometimes because of that pressing. All of this in terms of the coaching, lack of discipline, everyone's noted that. Some failure in details. It looks like everyone's pressing out there. And at a certain point, that does come down to coaching as well. I'm going to talk more about that once the season is over. In terms of, people want to talk about Matt Nagy versus Eric Bieniemy. Chiefs have always kind of had some issues with some of these things. And so I don't think it's quite that simple. But eventually, if things keep going that poorly, eventually a head probably has to roll. It's obviously not going to be Andy. So it's going to be kind of an interesting thing to see what they do moving forward in terms of who gets the blame for how poorly things went, or if they kid themselves and say that this was purely a personnel issue. Was it largely a personnel issue? Yes. Were there other answers available to them that could have helped fix it? I think so, even schematically and in terms of player discipline and in terms of kind of keeping everything cohesive and together. And that comes back to coaching at that point. So that's gross, all of it. But I hope it's at least somewhat enlightening in terms of how it's not just one thing. It is everything, and they're stacking on top of each other. And that's how you can have an offense with the best quarterback in football looking not just average, but sub-average. It's when everything else is going wrong. And my hope is that the Chiefs kind of take some of the lessons from this year, depending on how things play out, and understand that last year was not necessarily a template, because it's really hard to get those things right. So we'll see how things go. They still have an elite defense. They do still have Mahomes and Kelsey. But boy, the clock is not just ticking. The clock has almost stopped ticking. You are almost out of time. But you know who's also out of time? That's me. So I appreciate you guys watching. Make sure to hit like, subscribe. Again, this is depressing stuff, but I hope it's at least somewhat educational, perhaps, or if nothing else, cathartic. Either way, I appreciate you guys a great deal. Merry Christmas. It is